Welcome everyone. Let's make a start. We're really pleased to have Jill Rutter with us today. I met Jill probably 4 or 5 years ago now when she was at the Institute for Government. She invited me along to participate in a panel there about women on boards. And since then I've followed her, and I'm always really happy when I hear her on the radio talking about things, because you know that you're going to get expert, informed and very interesting and kind of realistic, I think, commentary from Jill. So that's why we asked her along to come and talk about one of the big issues of the day, which is Brexit. So Jill, just as a bit of background, she's a former civil servant. She'd worked at AT Treasury, had been in business at BP for a while, and also at DEFRA for some time. So she knows government from inside out. After that, she went to the Institute for Government, which is a kind of I guess, kind of a group who kind of reflect on and think about how government works and write many interesting reports on the topic, and is now a research fellow at UK and the Changing Europe, and is a visiting faculty member, visiting professor at King's, and has written on a wide range of issues about government. I really suggest, if you're interested in public issues, follow Jill's Twitter, which is Jill on Government. Jill on Govt, I should say.
Govt, yeah, Govt is what I use as a short form for government, but anyway, so.
Good. So that's why we've got Jill along today. So let's kick off by asking the question, where are we on Brexit, Jill?
So the truth is that, that we don't really know. What we do know is, in terms of negotiations are going on, taking place in Brussels this week. Last week, Michel Barnier and his team were in London. Some of you might have seen Michel Barnier tweeting a picture of him going for a walk in Regent's Park, looking for a level playing field. We've seen this sort of trolling on Twitter of the UK before, Barnier sort of getting into the game. So they're discussing. I've just seen someone tweet, and this is sort of what we're reduced to, is following people on Twitter, saying that there's been a meeting of EU ambassadors convened for Friday with one topic on the agenda, which is Brexit. There is a virtual European Council on Thursday. Some thought that might be a critical meeting to sign a Brexit deal off, but it looks as though they'll probably have other preoccupations, like the impasse they're on at the moment on their budget, with the Polish and Hungarian hold up there to the coronavirus rescue packages and the new financing. So it looks like there's action this week. People are saying, could there be a deal? My leading indicator that Monday might be the day for a deal is that's the day I am having my currently very crummy internet upgraded, hopefully, fingers crossed. And so I might be out for the count for the day, which could mean you wait 4.5 years for a Brexit deal, and then it comes on the day you are incommunicado. Other people are saying it could go to early December. What we've seen is that deadlines come and go. We're told, we have had a moving deadline. David Frost said it had to be tied up by the end of September. He actually fixed himself a new job, which I understand has now had to be backfilled because he's otherwise preoccupied as the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor. Boris Johnson set that deadline of the European Council in October. We had a brief breakup of the talks, and then they got back together again. Michel Barnier had all along said Halloween was the drop-dead deadline. Then people were saying, well, it could go a couple of days beyond that. And clearly we're, more than a couple of weeks beyond a Halloween deadline now. But you do end up against the fact that this is not like last year when we were in the Article 50 process, when it was quite easy to ask for extensions. It wasn't always clear the EU would grant them, but there was provisions there. We've now let the deadline for asking for an extension pass. That happened at the end of June. So, there is a very firm deadline, we think, which is that the UK ends the transition, deal or no deal, on the 31st of December. And we have to allow a bit of time for ratification by the European Parliament. And the government seems to think, David Frost told the Parliamentary Select Committee, that the UK government would also need primary legislation of some sort to get Parliament to agree to its deal.
Okay, so we're coming to almost what seems like, after so many deadlines, to this hard barrier in some ways. So what do you think the potential different outcomes are going to be? So you talk about this thin...
Can I assume Andre was was asking what a deal might look like, because I think that's what he was
exactly.
asking me.
I was just going to say, I think we have, that is what I thought as well. So hello, I'm the backup host in case this exact thing happens. Yeah, Jill, indeed. I think the question was, what are the potential outcomes that we're looking at? And
so what's the potential
likelihood
outcomes
of the different ones?
Yeah, well, what is quite interesting is that actually the range of outcomes are now quite narrow. There's quite a big difference between deal or no deal. We can discuss what that is. But there were a whole range of different Brexit outcomes that were in play earlier on. You'll remember Michel Barnier used to brandish that staircase diagram that had the sort of pictures, and it ranged from a very close relationship like Norway, a Ukraine-style deal. I think we even wrote something at the Institute for Government talking about a reverse Ukraine. Ukraine is gradual accession. We thought that could look like gradual departure. We had the options of, so Norway, Ukraine, you had a Turkish solution where you were in a customs union. Remember, Parliament spent a lot of time debating the customs union. We then had Theresa May's much derided Chequers deal, which would have seen the UK maintain quite a lot of regulatory alignment on goods with the EU. And until some different solution was found in order to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, there would have been a temporary, in inverted commas, UK-EU customs arrangement. All of that is now sort of out of the window. So the choice is between what I think is probably right to call a Canada Plus deal proposed by the UK, which would be going a bit beyond Canada, zero tariffs, zero quotas, but also some additional facilitations on customs, sort of things like animal health checks, some of those regulatory checks. The UK started off asking for quite a few things on services. It's probably had to drop most of those. The EU accused them of cherry picking. Remember, that is the biggest EU insult there. Remember Donald Tusk and his cherry cake in Salzburg a couple of years ago. But we would have deals on aviation. We would have deals potentially on energy cooperation. Critically, and this is an area where the UK for once recognized geography, a deal on truck permits, which matters a lot. Doesn't matter, not a feature of the Canada deal, because not very many trucks go from Montreal and drive down to Marseille or whatever, but a lot of trucks drive from Birmingham to Barcelona and south, so that sort of matters. So we'd have those sorts of things in a deal. We would also, and everybody focuses, and I know it's a business school audience, so you're not very interested in this, but we would also have a deal on security cooperation, not the depth of security cooperation we have now. That's not on the cards because of the UK's rejection of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, but for security cooperation, things about intelligence sharing, data sharing potentially would be easier, and police cooperation. So we don't know quite the parameters of where those would be, but that's what a deal looks like. But the difference between those other sort of more deep deals is that we are out of the single market and the customs union. That means inevitably there may be no tariffs, at least on UK qualifying goods, but you have to prove that a good is UK qualifying. And you will have seen an earlier debate between the car industry and David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator, about the pesky rules of origin. Remember, the UK is to a large extent an assembly platform. We import a lot of components, and that really matters for whether things qualify for preferential tariffs. The EU, I think, traditionally offers about 20% non-local content. The UK needs 55% non-local content for most of our car exports to qualify for preferential tariffs. A letter from Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands, on behalf of the car industry this week to Liz Truss, the International Trade Secretary, and to David Frost on that. So still lots of custom formalities, and you have to go through a lot of hoops to qualify for those preferential tariffs as well. Still a lot of regulatory checks. Theresa May wanted to avoid those by alignments in regulation on goods, but Boris Johnson doesn't. He wants to stay outside the EU's regulatory orbit, doesn't want to be in their regulatory agencies, so lots of new checks there, but also on services, and this is particularly relevant talking to the city, financial service and data are always going to be subject to separate processes, because those are all subject to autonomous equivalence or data adequacy decisions. And we haven't had either of those from the EU yet. Less likely to be rapidly forthcoming in the event of no deal, I think it's fair to say, but they're not part of the negotiations as such. But also much harder to do business. If you're a services business, you lose sort of rights of establishment. We lose mutual recognition and professional qualifications. Potentially, if you can't access an EU passport, lots of people, of course, have discovered dual nationality as the big growth industry of Brexit. But if you can't access an EU passport, then you may need a visa to go and do business in the EU, probably not.
You're on mute, Andre.
Right. So I think she's saying that business services are, you need a passport to access business services. So say if you need to spend a certain number of time outside of the UK. That was one point.
Okay, good. I was just going to ask whether you could hear providing services businesses, the sort of thing that the City of London does, but other centres as well. You go and do work, go consult, you do things. All of those will become more difficult after the sort of Brexit, even with a deal. No.
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
No, it did. It will be more difficult even with a deal, right? That was the last thing we caught.
Yeah.
Now, the next question I would have is, so we've got a kind of a perspective on business. One of the things you're an expert on is the civil service, and you wrote something, I think, for Prospect magazine about sort of civil service impartiality and the role of Brexit. I wonder if you could say something about that.
It poses for the civil service is that people who believe in Brexit, and that's not so amenable to analyze the facts. And one of the troubles, if you talk to civil servants, particularly under Theresa May's, one of the big problems they had, we all remember Sean Spicer in the Trump administration talking about, okay, I'm going to switch off my video, the suggestion there, let's see whether that improves things. So problems that the government, that civil servants have within government, particularly under the Theresa May government, which remember was split down the middle on Brexit. She tried to balance Brexiters and non-Brexiters in her cabinet. Boris Johnson for a totally different strategy. Was that ministers just were talking past each other. They couldn't even agree on sort of common sets of issues for civil servants to present them options from. That's a huge, big difficulty. And partly because of the way the Treasury was used by George Osborne during the referendum, remember those forecasts that he went when Project Fear was suggesting the big issue was the economy, partly because a lot of Brexiters think that the civil service is part of the metropolitan elite that was a bastion of Remain, partly because people thought raising any practical problems about Brexit was basically denying Brexit and trying to frustrate Brexit. This called, I think, into question a lot of the sort of norms about what we think of the civil service. Civil service is very used to working one day for a government of this persuasion, a Labour government. The next day you're working for a coalition government. It's a bit of adaptation. We're not used to that. Then you're working for a Conservative majority government. Over the last 12 years, civil servants had to do all of those. But to work for a sort of, project that actually the government of the day hadn't supported, and which is very poorly defined, and which is splitting views in a very visceral, Mark Sedwill used the word identity way, poses a whole range of different problems. And one of the things Mark Sedwill noted, which I also, I think, mentioned in that article you mentioned, Andre, was when Ollie Robbins, remember he's now at Goldman Sachs, but was the chief negotiator under Theresa May, when he went to a parliamentary select committee, one of the MPs, a Brexit supporting MP, said, you know, Mr. Robbins, in your heart, do you believe in Brexit? And as Mark Sedwill told the committee yesterday, that's just not a question you should ask our civil service. You know, people do not believe in their heart in every policy they work off, you know, to do it. And actually, one of the sort of rules about the civil service is no one should ask you what your personal views are, or certainly how you voted, what your personal political views are. And for the good civil servants, people, I think ministers find it quite hard to figure out what they are.
That's a really excellent point. Now, I know you've been talking a lot about the kind of departure of Dominic Cummings in the last week. What effect do you think this might have on kind of Brexit and post-Brexit?
We don't know, I think, because what we don't know is the extent to which the Prime Minister has strong views on where he wants this Brexit deal to land, and therefore the extent to which having Cummings lurking in number 10, you know, would have steeled him for no deal or would have persuaded him to compromise. The Prime Minister has a strong view. Remember that even Dominic Cummings is only an advisor. And there are issues on which the Prime Minister has overruled Dominic Cummings. We know Dominic Cummings is an HS2 skeptic, but the Prime Minister likes, you know, big shiny train kits. So the Prime Minister gave HS2 the go-ahead. What we don't know is the extent to which Dominic Cummings at this stage was engaged in Brexit, the extent to which he had strong views. I think, you know, so we have to see. One of the most worrying things, I think, about the departures, the reports of the departures of Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane, was they were seen as the only two people who could really get the Prime Minister to make decisions. And ultimately, the Prime Minister has to make a call. And ultimately, this can only be his call. No one else can make this decision. He can ask his cabinet, but this is an incredibly passive cabinet. It may be that Michael Gove is quite influential. It may be that Rishi Sunak is quite influential, but really the Brexit call is his and his alone to make. Where I think the Dominic Cummings departure may be more interesting is in the what next agenda. We saw, and one of the big sticking points, and we'll see whether this changes, was over state aid, whether the UK would sign up to some limitations on its ability to subsidise. We heard that one of the big motivations, a very odd sticking point for a Conservative government to have, and it's a very odd sticking point in many ways for a UK government to have. The UK uses state aid much less than most other European countries, and previous Conservative governments have been big architects of the EU state aid regime. It's a very odd ditch for a Conservative government to die in. But one of the stories we heard was this was all part of the Dominic Cummings vision for the UK's post-Brexit future, where government largesse would help the UK develop tech giants that would take on the Amazons, the eBays, the Netflix, whatever, and that it was state aid that was lack of state aid that might be holding that back. That all actually seems a bit implausible. So I don't think state aid is the big mover and shaker behind that. The other, of course, big agenda he was behind was the creation of the UK DARPA, and that was going ahead, I think, in any case. So I think, it's probably in defining that future. Did Dominic Cummings want a big deregulatory bonanza? Possibly, but is there a big appetite for that in the country? Don't think so. That's not the revealed preference of Parliament so far. And indeed, one of the few concessions during the passage of Brexit legislation that the government is forced to make is over-establishing this new agriculture and trade permanent body, because so many MPs have been worried that the UK will use Brexit to water down animal welfare standards by doing a trade deal with the US.
I'd like to remind people, if they have any questions, please put them into the into the Q&A function, and then we can pick them up. But I have one other question which I'd like to ask. So I think it was in the prospect piece, you sort of said that we're in for a very British way of resolving the dilemma, where we get what we appeared to ask for, but end up quite dissatisfied with it. It's kind of like a slightly misjudged Christmas present you can't return to the shop. I wonder what you're getting at there.
I think what is very interesting is there's an article that is in the upcoming edition of Prospect that's already been tweeted out online, and we have been subject to massive pylons as a result of it, called "Who Kills Soft Brexit?" And the question we're asking is: I talked at the start about the problem, about the fact that we were now heading for a very hard Brexit, so the bottom of that Barnier staircase. But that doesn't look as though it's where the majority of British people are. Increasing numbers of polls suggest that most people, I think people in every region now think Brexit was a mistake. That was some polling out last week. If you present people with choices in a more deliberative way, and University College London did this a couple of years ago, in a deliberative assembly, and you say to them, well, you basically have to trade in the economy versus free movement. I think attitudes to migration have changed really a lot since the referendum. That was one of the big drivers of at least some of the Brexit vote. People say, well, at the end of the day, we can do things domestically about migration, impose some of those sorts of controls never really used. And maybe at the end of the day, free trade, trade with our European partners is more important. So what you've got, I think, is the government moving towards an increasingly hardline view of Brexit, whereas the British people are all having a bit of second thoughts that, God, was it really going to be this difficult? It's a bit of a nightmare. It depends how you interpret last year's Get Brexit Done vote. Was it a, yes, we really are all guns blazing for a really hard form of Brexit, or was it, oh my God, we just want this to stop? And I think quite a big bit of the vote last year was from the, oh my God, can we just talk about something else? By that, they didn't last year mean, let's have a pandemic Brexit off every front page. They meant, let's just move on and get on with the rest of our lives. So anyway.
So there's a question here in the Q&A. So if Brexit was a mistake and we have had bad times coming next year, deal or no deal, are there any potential long-term positive outcomes you can see for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting. I do think that I'm going to offer you some positive outcomes, bouncy moment. There are long-term economic hits, most economic analysis suggests, from moving to a more distant relationship with our long-term trading partner, with our biggest trading bloc on the EU. But the economy will adapt over time. We don't have the opportunity Australia had, Andre, when Australia and New Zealand suffered that very severe economic shock from the UK ditching them when we joined the EU, of saying, actually, well, don't we have a big growing economy in our neighborhood, and let's reorientate ourselves and export ourselves to China. So we don't really have quite that option, but there are other trade possibilities. I think the more interesting question is, does this provide some sort of internal catalyst for us to finally get on top of some of the problems that have dogged the British economy for a long time? We haven't got the EU to blame anymore. I think that's actually quite good. Forces us, taking back control means taking back responsibility. We can't blame EU red tape. We'll have to make loads of decisions ourselves about the sort of regulatory regimes we want. But we all know that one of the big long-standing problems of the British economy is productivity, and in particular the post-2008 really poor performance on productivity. We're great at jobs, but we're not great at productivity. Maybe, particularly turning off the tap of free movement means we'll have to get better about productivity, and that will give a bit of a shock. Might mean we'll do something about actually saying, why do we recruit so many skilled people in from elsewhere? Are we finally going to have a skills strategy that works, which we haven't done? Are we going to address, I mean, harder because, you know, the economy takes a bit of a hit, but are we going to address that long tail of educational underachievement that's particularly concentrated in areas which suffer from chronic long-term deprivation? So if it gives a big political wake-up call, I think there are potential benefits from that. But just because you get the wake-up call, you know, you can always turn over in bed and just hit the button and stay asleep. So there's always a risk we will do that, and we will just be refighting other wars and stuff like that, and not focusing. But if you look, you know, the government now, one of the pluses of having a convinced Brexit supporting government is it has every incentive over the next 3.5 years to show that Brexit was a good decision, and that actually British policymakers, you could regard Brexit as a bit of a vote of confidence in British policymakers, that British policymakers can genuinely do a good job. And there are areas where you sort of think, well, of course, we should be able to do stuff that is more tailored to UK circumstances. One of the very few secretaries of state, this isn't probably of much interest to most of your listeners, but one of the few secretaries of state who, Theresa May, started to define a bit of what a post-Brexit future could look like was Michael Gove as Environment Secretary. And he set out a path to a radical reorientation of one of the bits of the EU policy that you always thought, for God's sake, surely we can do better than that, which was the Common Agricultural Policy, by moving over to payment for public goods. So you know, hopefully there will be other opportunities where we can do some of that.
Okay. So I think we better leave it there, Jill. So a vote of confidence potentially in some opportunities for fixing long-term issues in the UK economy. So let me thank you very much, Jill, for participating, and let me remind the viewers that the next week we're going to have Stefan Stern, who's an ex-FT journalist, writes frequently, and he's going to talk with us about leadership. And then the week after that, we'll have Vasilis Katsos, who's at VNK Capital, and he's going to talk about what happens when you sell a company. And then the final food for thought of this series, we're going to hear from David Feingrow, who's an archaeologist, and he's going to talk about the kind of long-term effects and thinking about group size and what 30,000 years of evidence will tell. So thank you, Jill. Thank you, and sorry for my internet. Okay, no worries. It's been fascinating to hear from you, and thank you all, and enjoy the Brexit coming week. Bye-bye.